Since its founding, the people of Washington, D.C. have been struggling to get some form of representation in government, with the residents of the city not even being able to vote in presidential elections until 1964, after the passage of the 23rd Amendment. And it wasn't until 1971 that D.C. was given a permanent representative in Congress, with the creation of their own electoral district and a seat in the House of Representatives. However, this wasn't without controversy, because even though the people of DC are able to elect someone to Congress, since it is not a state, according to the US Constitution, their representatives are not able to vote on any legislation. Now, this wasn't the first time that DC was given some form of representation in Congress, with the city electing their first representative to the House back in 1871. However, only 4 years later, that representation would soon be taken away, with this largely being the result of a series of political scandals that emerged as Washington, D.C. began expanding after the end of the Civil War. Now, during the Civil War, the population of Washington County rapidly increased due to the influx of a large number of Union troops and the arrival of many African Americans who were fleeing the Confederacy. As a result, the population of the region grew from around 75,000 to almost 132,000. With the black population going from around 18% before the war to almost 34% by the 1870s. Therefore, as the city grew, more and more citizens began lobbying the government to have some form of representation in Congress, with there also being some minor concerns as the US kept expanding further and further out west. The government might move the capital to a new location closer to the middle of the country, with several people proposing that the capital be moved to St. Louis, Chicago, or Cincinnati, as these cities were also some of the largest and most important centers of trade in the country during this time. However, that didn't end up happening, with the federal government eventually combining the settlements of the city of Washington, Georgetown, and Washington County into the District of Columbia, as well as creating a territorial governor of the district, who would be appointed by the president, and a non-voting representative to Congress, who would be elected by the people. Now, during this time, the Republican Ulysses S. Grant was President of the United States, and the two leading Republican candidates to represent D.C. in Congress were close friends of his. The first was Norton P. Chipman, a lawyer who had served as a general in the Union Army, with Chipman becoming well known for prosecuting a Confederate captain for a series of war crimes that occurred at Andersonville Prison during the war, where around 13,000 Union prisoners died. And the second was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who had become a leading abolitionist and was one of the most important leaders of the African American community during the 1800s, with Douglass having campaigned for Grant during the 1868 presidential election. Now, when Chipman ended up being chosen as the Republican Party's candidate, Douglass accepted this decision and even went on to campaign for him by rallying the support of the local African American community. This led Chipman to win the election and become the district's first representative to Congress. And for the next few years, Chipman would continue to advocate for the people of DC. However, since he wasn't allowed to vote in Congress, there wasn't much he could do in terms of getting legislation passed. Now, during this time, the Grant administration continued to push forward civil rights for African Americans, as well as fight the rise of racist terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. However, several scandals related to corruption, mismanagement, and nepotism also began to emerge. This is because while Grant wasn't personally corrupt himself, he was well known for giving his close friends and family powerful and lucrative positions in government. For example, in relation to the government of DC, Grant had appointed Henry D. Cook to be the first governor of the district, with Cook's older brother Jay being a friend of Grant's, as well as an extremely wealthy investment banker who had helped raise more than $500 million for the Union government during the Civil War, with Jay wanting his brother to have this new government office so he could use his power and influence to help grow the family fortune, and not to help the people of DC. And it was under Henry Cook's administration where a man named Alexander Robey Shepard was appointed to be the vice president of the local Board of Public Works, which was responsible for improving the local infrastructure of the city. And from this unelected office, Shepard would soon grow to become one of the most powerful politicians in the district. Now, Shepard was not part of the traditional elite of the city. He had dropped out of school after his father had passed away, but he found success by rising up through the ranks of a local plumbing and gas company. This was helped by the fact that in the mid-1800s, DC still lacked a lot of necessary infrastructure, with the city's landscape largely being covered by uneven roads made of dirt and mud, half-finished projects such as the Washington Monument, as well as several open sewers. Therefore, by upgrading the local infrastructure and providing many new buildings with improved heating, lighting, and drainage systems, Shepard was able to become one of the richest and most successful businessmen in DC when he was still only in his 30s. And while Shepard was a firm Republican and had even fought for the Union during the Civil War, he was also a social conservative, with both sides of his family having been slave owners. Therefore, after the war ended, he was pretty ambivalent about issues related to racial or social equality. This led him to come into conflict with the more progressive members of his party, known as Radical Republicans, who heavily pushed to expand and protect civil rights for African Americans. However, at the same time, as a nouveau riche businessman, Shepard also clashed with the old money elite of DC, who were largely Southern Democrats that advocated for the interests of white men, especially former Confederates. It is also important to note that this distinction between Republicans and Democrats during Reconstruction has very little to do with the modern Republican and Democratic parties, as both parties have realigned multiple times over the past 150 years, leading the Democrats to now be the party of social progressives and economic liberals, while the Republicans have largely become the party of social and economic conservatives. Now, in spite of all this, Shepard's success in the plumbing and gas industry, as well as his membership in the Republican Party, made him an ideal candidate for the Board of Public Works, with Shepard using his position to enact a series of large-scale infrastructure projects across the city. As noted by author John P. Richardson, the board paved many roads, built new sidewalks, upgraded the old water supply, and planted thousands of trees across the city. Shepard even filled in part of the aging Washington Canal, which by that time had become polluted and was being used as an open sewer, and soon a new street was built on top of it, with this area now being known as Constitution Avenue. However, by starting so many large-scale projects all at once, the board would often go over budget, with it being discovered that while they were only given $6 million to improve the city, they ended up spending almost $18 million. And over time, many residents of DC, as well as some members of Congress, came to see the Board of Public Works as being one small part of the increasingly corrupt and incompetent administration of President Grant, with some Republicans even breaking away to form the Liberal Republican Party, who tried and failed to remove Grant from office during the 1872 presidential election. If you'd like to learn more about this, check out Sean Munger's video about this election. Now, things got even worse the following year in 1873, when a financial panic led thousands of businesses to fail, unemployment to skyrocket, and several banks to collapse. Nationally, the most prominent bank to fail was J. Cook & Company, which was run by Henry Cook's older brother, with this chaos eventually leading Henry to resign from government, and for Grant to promote Shepard to be the new governor of DC. Now, closer to home, the collapse of the Freedmen's Savings Bank had terrible consequences for the local African American community. The bank had initially been founded at the end of the Civil War as a way for newly freed slaves to start saving their money and build up some wealth. The bank also provided several of these freedmen with jobs, allowing them to get an education in finance and banking. And while headquartered in DC, over time, they ended up opening several new branches across the country. But after 1870, the bank also began to take on riskier and riskier investments. Most notably, Henry Cook, who was also on the bank's board, encouraged multiple investments to be made into businesses which had close ties to his brother Jay, such as the Northern Pacific Railway. Therefore, during the 1873 panic, when many of these businesses failed, it contributed to the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank, leading more than 61,000 people to lose almost $3 million worth of savings, with this not only hurting individual members of the African American community, but also many churches and small businesses who had also kept their money at the bank. Therefore, as his economic situation worsened and the huge levels of spending by the Board of Public Works became more well known, the citizens of DC, as well as Congress, grew increasingly resentful of Governor Shepard, who was seen as wasting millions of dollars on a series of failed infrastructure projects, with Congress eventually abolishing the office of governor in 1874 and removing DC's representation in the House in 1875. Now, even though many people did not like Governor Shepard, they saw the removal of Chipman as going too far because most of the issues related to corruption and overspending came from the members of the Board of Public Works, who were all appointed to office, while Chipman, who was elected by the public, was not involved in the scandal at all. But a few months later, after the Democratic Party was able to win a majority in the House, little hope remained for an openly racist and white supremacist party to give political representation to a city which had a growing African American population and had elected a Republican to Congress twice. And soon afterwards, both Chipman and Shepard would eventually end up moving out west. Chipman moved to California to work in the lumber trade, before eventually returning to the law and becoming a judge, while Shepard ended up going to Mexico, where he became involved with the local silver mining industry. And most importantly, after going through so much, the people of DC will be left without any representation in Congress for almost the next 100 years. Thank you for watching this video. If you are from Washington, DC, let me know what you think of your local politics, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks so much to my patrons, Untroid, NMS, and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.